He had been watching the road longer than anyone could remember. Every morning just after sunrise, when the mountain air still carried the cool scent of pine and wood smoke drifting from distant cabins, Staff Sergeant Daniel Carter drove his old Ford F-150 down County Route 18, the same narrow two-lane road that curled along the hills outside the small Colorado town of Silver Creek. And every morning, without fail, he saw the same thing waiting at mile marker 42. A lone German shepherd sitting perfectly still on the gravel shoulder, ears upright, amber eyes fixed on the long stretch of asphalt disappearing into the valley below, as if the road itself held a promise the rest of the world had forgotten. The first time Daniel noticed the dog, he assumed it belonged to someone nearby, maybe a rancher letting his working dog roam before breakfast. But something about the animal's posture lingered in his mind long after he passed it. The dog wasn't wandering, wasn't sniffing the grass or chasing birds like most dogs would on a quiet mountain morning. It was simply sitting there, calm and patient, staring down the highway with a focus so steady it almost felt human. The second morning Daniel saw it again in the exact same place. Same posture, same quiet watchfulness, the early sunlight brushing the dog's sable coat with streaks of gold, while frost still clung to the roadside weeds like scattered glass. By the third morning, curiosity began to settle in his chest like a small stone he couldn't shake. Daniel slowed his truck as he approached mile marker 42, rolling past at barely 20 miles per hour while the tires crunched softly over the edge of the pavement. And for a brief moment the dog turned its head toward him. Their eyes met. There was no fear in the animal's gaze, no excitement either, just a calm awareness before the dog slowly turned back toward the road, as if Daniel's presence had never mattered in the first place. Daniel continued driving, but found himself glancing into the rearview mirror long after the dog disappeared behind the bend. That afternoon the thought returned again while he was repairing a fence line outside town, the image of the dog sitting alone against the wide mountain sky replaying quietly in his mind. In Silver Creek, most people knew each other's animals. Stray dogs didn't last long in a place this small. Someone would claim them, feed them, bring them home. Yet no one had mentioned this one. The next morning Daniel left his house a little earlier than usual, the dashboard clock reading 6:17 a.m. as pale dawn light spilled across the ridges, and as he rounded the final curve before mile marker 42, he already knew what he would see. The German shepherd was there again, sitting in the exact same spot beside the road, body still, eyes locked on the empty highway stretching miles into the valley. No collar jingled, no tail wagged, just quiet waiting beneath the endless Colorado sky, as though the dog believed with absolute certainty that sooner or later someone would appear around that distant bend, and when that moment finally came it would be ready. By the fourth morning Daniel Carter found himself thinking about the dog before he even reached the truck, the image of that quiet figure sitting beside the highway lingering in his mind like an unfinished sentence. The sky above Silver Creek was pale blue and wide, the kind of Colorado morning that felt clean enough to start a new life, and a thin ribbon of mist drifted along the valley floor as Daniel turned the key in the ignition of his old Ford. The engine rumbled awake, steady and familiar, and he began the same 15-mile drive that had become routine since returning from service, winding through fields of frost-covered grass and scattered ranch fences that stretched toward the foothills. As the truck climbed the final rise toward mile marker 42, he slowed again without thinking, easing his foot from the gas pedal as if the road itself expected him to do it. The dog was there, exactly where it had been every morning before, sitting tall with its front paws aligned neatly on the gravel shoulder and its gaze fixed on the distant bend in the highway. The sun had just begun to clear the mountains and light spilled across the animal's coat, revealing shades of dark sable and soft brown that shimmered against the cold morning air. Daniel pulled the truck onto the gravel this time, the tires crunching quietly as he rolled to a stop about 20 feet away. For a moment nothing happened. The engine idled softly while a breeze moved through the dry grass along the roadside, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. Daniel rested his hands on the steering wheel and studied the dog more closely than before. It looked healthy enough, lean but strong, the posture of an animal that had once known discipline. Its ears were sharp and alert, its back straight, and there was something about the stillness of its body that reminded Daniel of a soldier standing watch. Slowly he opened the truck door and stepped out, his boots touching the gravel with a soft crunch that echoed across the quiet stretch of road. The dog turned its head toward him again, those amber eyes meeting his for a brief second before drifting back toward the highway, as if the conversation had already ended. Daniel took a few cautious steps closer, stopping about 10 feet away so he would not startle it. "Hey there, boy," he said gently, his voice low and steady the way he used to speak to working dogs during training exercises years ago. The dog did not move toward him. It did not retreat either. It simply remained seated, calm and patient, the wind stirring the thick fur along its neck. Daniel crouched down slowly and rested his elbows on his knees, studying the animal with quiet curiosity. There were no tags that he could see from where he stood, no obvious mark of ownership, yet something about the dog felt too composed to be a stray. Minutes passed in silence while trucks occasionally rolled through the valley miles away, their distant sound fading like thunder beyond the hills. Finally, Daniel stood up and walked back to his truck, opening the passenger door and reaching inside the small cooler he kept on the seat. He pulled out a wrapped sandwich he had packed for lunch and tore off a small piece of bread. When he tossed it gently onto the gravel a few feet from the dog, the animal glanced at it only briefly before returning its attention to the road. Daniel waited, but the dog never moved to eat. It was as if hunger itself had taken second place to whatever promise lay hidden beyond that quiet bend in the highway. Daniel Carter did not expect the dog to ignore the bread. Most dogs would have rushed forward the moment food touched the ground, especially on a cold mountain morning when the air carried the sharp bite of early winter. Yet the German Shepherd barely acknowledged it. The animal simply remained seated with quiet discipline, eyes fixed on the stretch of empty highway that curved through the valley like a ribbon of pale gray steel. Daniel stood beside his truck for a long moment, watching the strange exchange between hunger and patience play out in silence. The wind shifted slightly, stirring dry grass along the roadside and carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from distant cabins tucked against the hillside. Somewhere far off, a pickup truck passed through town, its sound fading into the wide, open quiet that defined mornings in Silver Creek. Daniel slowly crossed his arms and leaned against the side of his truck, studying the dog with the careful attention of someone used to reading small details. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him that posture could tell a story long before words ever did. The dog's shoulders were relaxed but steady, its ears alert without tension, its breathing calm and measured. This was not the restless stance of a stray animal searching for scraps. This was the posture of something waiting with purpose. Daniel bent down again and picked up another piece of bread from the sandwich wrapper, tossing it a little closer this time, so it landed only a few feet from the dog's paws. The shepherd glanced down briefly, nose twitching once as the scent reached it, then lifted its gaze back toward the road, as though the distant bend held greater importance than any meal. Daniel could not help but let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You are one stubborn soldier," he murmured under his breath. The words slipped out naturally, surprising even him. The dog's ears flicked slightly at the sound of his voice, but the animal still did not move. Minutes passed that way while the early morning sun climbed higher above the ridge line, slowly warming the frost that clung to the gravel shoulder. The light revealed faint tracks in the dust near the dog's resting spot, small worn paths that suggested the animal had been pacing the same few feet of ground for days, or perhaps weeks. Daniel noticed something else then, something subtle but unmistakable. Around the dog's neck there was a thin strip of worn leather barely visible beneath the thick fur, the faded outline of an old collar that had clearly seen better days. There was no shining metal tag reflecting the sunlight, no bright color to catch the eye, only that quiet trace of something once important. Daniel straightened and rubbed a hand along the back of his neck while he looked out toward the valley. The highway stretched empty for miles, disappearing between two low hills before dropping toward the distant town limits. Whoever the dog was waiting for had not appeared yet. Daniel climbed back into the driver's seat and shut the truck door, but he did not start the engine right away. Instead, he rested his hands on the steering wheel and watched the animal through the windshield for another minute. The shepherd remained perfectly still beside the road, patient as a lighthouse watching the horizon. Finally, Daniel turned the key and the engine rumbled back to life. As he pulled away, he glanced once more through the side mirror. The dog was already looking back toward the road, as though the brief encounter had never happened at all, as though the only thing that mattered in its world was the possibility that somewhere beyond that distant bend a familiar figure might finally return. The rest of that day, the image of the waiting dog followed Daniel Carter like a quiet echo he could not shake. While he worked along the fence line outside Silver Creek, tightening loose wire and replacing a weathered wooden post, his thoughts kept drifting back to mile marker 42 and the strange discipline of the German Shepherd that had refused even the smallest piece of food. The wind across the open pasture carried the smell of dry grass and distant pine trees, and every time Daniel paused to straighten his back, he found himself staring toward the highway as though the answer to the mystery might somehow reveal itself across the wide Colorado hills. By late afternoon, the sun had shifted low over the mountains, painting the sky in soft gold and pale orange. Daniel loaded his tools into the back of his truck and wiped the dust from his hands on a worn cloth before climbing behind the wheel. Normally, he drove straight home at the end of the day, but this time he turned on a County Route 18 with a quiet sense of purpose he could not quite explain. The drive back toward mile marker 42 felt shorter in the evening light. Long shadows stretched across the asphalt while the distant ridges glowed under the fading sun. As Daniel rounded the familiar curve in the road, his eyes searched the gravel shoulder automatically. The German Shepherd was still there. The dog had not moved far from its morning position. It now stood instead of sitting, its tall silhouette outlined by the warm evening light, while its gaze remained fixed on the same stretch of highway disappearing between the hills. Daniel slowed the truck again and pulled onto the gravel shoulder, stopping about 15 feet away. This time when he stepped out, the dog did not turn immediately. It continued watching the road for several seconds, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. Only after the sound of Daniel's boots on the gravel reached its ears did the shepherd glance toward him. Up close, the animal looked even more striking than before. Its coat carried the rich, dark saddle typical of a working German shepherd, and its eyes held a calm intelligence that seemed almost familiar to Daniel. He walked a few steps closer, keeping his movements slow and steady. The breeze lifted the fur along the dog's neck slightly, revealing the worn leather collar more clearly now. The leather was cracked with age, the color faded from years of sun and weather. Daniel crouched carefully, stopping about 8 feet away. "You have been here all day, have you not?" he said quietly. The dog watched him for a moment, then turned its head back toward the road once again. That simple motion told Daniel everything he needed to know. Whatever the animal was waiting for had still not arrived. Daniel reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small bottle of water he kept for long days outdoors. He poured a little into the cap and gently slid it across the gravel toward the dog. This time the shepherd hesitated. Its nose lowered slowly toward the ground as it stepped forward just 2 cautious paces. The movement was careful, almost respectful, as if the dog did not wish to abandon its post for even a moment longer than necessary. It lapped the water once, then lifted its head again, ears rising as the distant sound of an approaching engine echoed faintly from somewhere down the valley road. Both Daniel and the dog turned toward the bend at the same time, watching as a single pickup truck appeared far in the distance and rolled slowly closer along the empty highway. The distant pickup truck rolled slowly closer along the valley highway, its tires humming softly against the asphalt while the evening light reflected off the windshield in brief flashes of gold. Daniel Carter remained crouched on the gravel shoulder, watching beside the German Shepherd as the vehicle approached the long bend in the road. The dog's posture changed in a way Daniel had not seen before. Its ears lifted higher, and its body leaned forward slightly, muscles tightening with quiet anticipation as though every instinct inside it had awakened at once. The truck grew larger as it traveled the final half-mile toward them, its engine echoing gently between the low hills that framed the valley. For a brief moment Daniel felt the same strange sense of expectation that seemed to guide the dog's every movement. The shepherd took 2 slow steps toward the edge of the pavement, eyes locked on the approaching vehicle with unwavering focus. Its tail remained still, but its entire body seemed alive with silent hope. Daniel rose to his feet, brushing the dust from his hands while he watched the truck pass closer and closer. The driver slowed slightly when he noticed the man and the dog standing near the shoulder, offering a casual wave through the open window before continuing past them toward Silver Creek. The moment the truck rolled by, the sound of its engine fading down the highway behind them, the shepherd stopped moving. Its body remained facing the road for several seconds longer, as though waiting for the truck to slow or turn around. When nothing happened, the dog's ears lowered just slightly, the tension in its shoulders easing back into the calm stillness Daniel had seen all morning. Without hesitation, the shepherd stepped back onto the gravel shoulder and returned to its exact spot beside the mile marker, sitting down once again with the same quiet patience it had shown all day. Daniel watched the small ritual unfold with growing understanding. That brief moment of anticipation had not been random curiosity. The dog had believed, even if only for a second, that the vehicle coming around the bend might be the one it had been waiting for. The realization settled heavily in Daniel's chest. This was not a stray wandering through the valley. This was a sentinel holding a promise. Daniel glanced down at the worn leather collar again, noticing the faint indentation where a metal tag had once hung before time and weather had erased its shine. He crouched beside the dog once more, resting his arms on his knees while the evening wind moved gently through the tall grass nearby. "You thought that was him, did you not?" Daniel said softly. The shepherd did not turn its head this time. Its amber eyes remained fixed on the empty stretch of road stretching toward the horizon where the sky was beginning to deepen into twilight. Cars would come and go. Hours would pass. Yet the dog's quiet watch continued without complaint. Daniel stayed there a little longer, sharing the silence beside the animal as the sky slowly shifted from gold to pale blue and the first cool breath of evening drifted down from the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, another engine echoed faintly along the valley road, and once again the dog's ears lifted toward the sound, ready to look down the highway with the same patient hope it carried every single time. The sound of the distant engine faded once again into the wide Colorado Valley, leaving the quiet stretch of highway wrapped in the slow calm of evening. Daniel Carter remained beside the German shepherd for several minutes after the second vehicle passed, watching the animal return to its silent watch as though the world around it moved according to a rhythm only it understood. The sky above the mountains had begun to soften into shades of violet and pale gray, while the last light of the sun touched the tips of the distant pine trees. Daniel finally stood and stretched his back, feeling the familiar pull of a long day's work settle into his shoulders. He glanced down at the dog once more. The shepherd had already settled into its place beside the mile marker again, sitting tall with its gaze resting on the empty road. It was the same posture Daniel had first noticed that morning, the same quiet discipline that now felt less mysterious and more deeply meaningful. After a moment, Daniel walked back to his truck and opened the passenger door. He reached into the cooler again, this time, pulling out a small plastic container that held a few slices of leftover roast beef he had packed for lunch but never eaten. When he stepped back toward the dog, he moved slowly, careful not to disturb the calm routine the animal seemed determined to maintain. Daniel knelt once more and placed a small piece of the meat gently on the gravel several feet in front of the shepherd. The scent drifted through the cool evening air almost immediately. The dog lowered its nose and studied the offering for a few seconds. Then, for the first time since Daniel had met it, the shepherd took 3 quiet steps forward and picked up the food. It chewed slowly and swallowed before stepping back to its position near the mile marker. Daniel allowed himself a faint smile. "That is a start," he said softly. The dog did not respond except for a brief flick of its tail that brushed the gravel behind it. The small gesture felt like progress. Daniel stayed beside the animal as twilight deepened across the valley. The road grew darker, and the occasional headlights of passing cars began to appear farther away in the distance. Each time a vehicle approached, the shepherd lifted its head and watched carefully, the same quiet anticipation appearing in its posture before slowly fading again once the vehicle passed by. Daniel noticed that the dog never barked, never chased the cars, never even stepped onto the pavement. It simply watched each one arrive and disappear, as if checking every possibility before returning to patient silence. After nearly half an hour, Daniel realized the temperature had begun to drop sharply. A cool wind moved down from the mountains, carrying the scent of night and distant snow. He rubbed his hands together and glanced toward the truck. "You are welcome to come with me, you know," he said gently as he stood. The shepherd turned its head slightly at the sound of his voice, but remained seated. The road ahead remained its focus. Daniel nodded slowly, as if accepting the answer without needing another explanation. He walked back to the truck and climbed into the driver's seat, leaving the door open for a moment longer while he looked back across the gravel shoulder. The German Shepherd still sat beside the mile marker under the dimming sky, a quiet guardian of the empty highway. Finally, Daniel started the engine and pulled slowly away, the truck rolling down the road while the dog remained behind in the growing darkness, still watching the same distant bend with a patience that seemed almost endless. The next morning the valley woke beneath a pale silver dawn, and the quiet town of Silver Creek slowly stretched back to life. Frost clung to the fence posts and the open fields like thin glass, while the first light spilled gently across the long highway leading out of town. Daniel Carter stood on the small wooden porch of his cabin with a mug of hot coffee warming his hands, looking out toward the distant hills while the events of the previous evening returned to his thoughts. He had seen many things during his years in the Marine Corps, moments of discipline, loyalty, and patience that most people never noticed, but something about the silent watch of that German Shepherd had settled deep in his mind. It was not simply a stray animal wandering through the mountains. There had been purpose in the way the dog sat beside that mile marker, the same way a sentry once stood watch outside a quiet base long after the rest of the world had gone to sleep. Daniel took another sip of coffee and glanced at the old clock hanging near the porch door. The morning was still young. Without fully deciding to do it, he set the mug down and grabbed his jacket from the chair beside him before walking toward the truck parked in the gravel driveway. The engine started with its familiar low rumble, and a few minutes later Daniel was driving once again along County Route 18 as the rising sun painted long shadows across the open valley. The road curved through the hills exactly as it had the day before, quiet and empty except for the occasional ranch gate or mailbox leaning beside the shoulder. As Daniel approached the final bend before mile marker 42, he slowed automatically, the truck rolling forward at a steady crawl. The gravel shoulder came into view, and there, exactly where it had been the day before, sat the German Shepherd. The dog's silhouette was outlined by the early sunlight, ears upright, and eyes focused on the same distant stretch of road that seemed to hold all of its attention. Daniel parked the truck and stepped out. Once more, the cold morning air brushing against his face while the quiet valley stretched around them. The shepherd glanced briefly in his direction this time, recognition flickering softly in its amber eyes before it returned to watching the road. Daniel crouched a few feet away and placed another small piece of food onto the gravel. The dog accepted it after a moment and returned to its post without hesitation. Daniel studied the worn leather collar again, noticing how the edges had curled with age and how a faint imprint suggested a metal tag had once rested there for years. Something about that detail stirred an old memory deep in Daniel's mind. Military working dogs often wore collars like that, simple and strong, designed for long hours of training beside soldiers who trusted them with their lives. Daniel rested his arms on his knees and looked down the highway where the morning light stretched for miles between the hills. "You are waiting for someone," he said quietly, more certain of the truth with each passing moment. The dog remained silent beside him, patient as ever, its eyes still locked on the empty road, as though somewhere beyond that distant curve the person it trusted most in the world might finally appear. Daniel Carter remained beside the dog longer that morning than he had planned, the quiet rhythm of the valley settling around them while the sun slowly climbed higher above the mountains. The highway stretched empty for miles, its pale gray surface reflecting the early light like a ribbon of glass cutting through the open land. The German Shepherd continued its patient watch, ears shifting slightly each time the wind carried a distant sound across the hills. Daniel noticed that the dog seemed to measure every movement along the road with careful attention, as if it had learned to recognize the difference between passing traffic and the single vehicle it truly expected to see. After a while Daniel stood and walked a few steps along the gravel shoulder, studying the ground around the mile marker. The dust showed faint marks where the dog had paced during the night, small worn paths that curved in a narrow circle before returning to the same spot beside the post. The pattern suggested that the animal rarely wandered far from that place, even after dark. Daniel crouched again and ran his hand gently across the rough wood of the mile marker. The white paint had faded under years of sun and winter storms, but the number was still visible against the weathered surface. 42 miles from the edge of the county. It was not a place most people would choose to stop unless they had a reason. Daniel glanced at the dog once more and noticed something new as the sunlight touched the old leather collar. Beneath the worn strap, there was a faint square outline pressed into the fur where a metal plate had once rested for a long time. The mark was subtle but unmistakable, the kind that appeared only after years of wearing the same tag every single day. Daniel felt the quiet certainty grow stronger inside him. The dog had belonged to someone who had worked beside it closely, someone who had trusted it enough to keep it near for years. The way the shepherd sat beside the road reminded him again of the sentries he had known during his time in uniform, soldiers who could hold their position through long nights simply because they believed their duty mattered. Daniel rested his forearms on his knees and looked down the highway where the road curved gently between two low hills before disappearing into the valley beyond. "You have been coming back here every day," he said softly, the realization forming slowly in his mind. The dog did not move from its post, but its ears lifted slightly at the sound of his voice. A pickup truck appeared far down the highway a moment later, little more than a moving shape in the distance. The shepherd leaned forward once again, hope flickering through its posture as it watched the vehicle approach. Daniel waited beside it, already knowing how the moment would end. The truck passed them with a low rumble and continued toward town without slowing. When the sound faded, the dog quietly returned to its sitting position beside the mile marker, its eyes settling once more on the distant curve in the road. Daniel exhaled slowly and stood up, the cool mountain air filling his lungs while a thought settled firmly in his mind. If the dog had been waiting this long, then somewhere along that empty stretch of highway there had to be a reason why. Daniel Carter stood quietly beside the mile marker for a few moments. Longer, watching the dog return to its silent watch as another passing vehicle disappeared down the valley road. The realization that there must be a reason behind this patient routine had settled firmly in his mind, and once the morning traffic faded again into silence, he walked slowly back toward his truck. The cool mountain air carried the faint scent of pine and distant wood smoke while the sun climbed higher across the wide Colorado sky. Daniel rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine, glancing once more through the windshield toward the German shepherd sitting faithfully beside the post. The dog had already turned its gaze back to the distant curve in the road, as though Daniel had simply been another temporary visitor passing through its long vigil. The truck rolled forward along the highway and Daniel drove slowly toward Silver Creek, his thoughts turning over the quiet details he had noticed during the past 2 days. The worn leather collar, the calm discipline of the dog's posture, the way it studied every approaching vehicle with careful hope before returning to silence. None of those things belonged to a stray animal wandering the countryside. Those were habits learned beside someone who had once worked with the dog every day. As the road descended toward town, the familiar buildings of Silver Creek appeared between the cottonwood trees lining the main street. It was the kind of small mountain town where people noticed unusual things quickly, and Daniel knew that if anyone understood the story behind the waiting dog, it would be someone here. He parked the truck near the corner diner where a few early customers were finishing breakfast beneath the warm glow of the windows. The bell above the door chimed softly as Daniel stepped inside, bringing with him a breath of crisp autumn air. The scent of fresh coffee and frying bacon filled the room, while sunlight filtered through the front windows onto the worn wooden tables. A few locals nodded in greeting as Daniel removed his jacket and took a seat at the counter. Behind the counter stood Martha Lawson, the diner's longtime owner, who had known nearly every resident in Silver Creek for decades. She poured him a cup of coffee without asking, sliding it across the counter with a familiar smile. Daniel wrapped his hands around the warm mug for a moment before speaking. "Martha, have you ever seen a German shepherd sitting out near mile marker 42 on County Route 18? He asked quietly. Martha paused while setting down the coffee pot, her expression shifting in a way that suggested the question was not entirely new to her. She leaned her elbows lightly on the counter and looked toward the front window for a moment before answering. "You mean the one that watches the road every morning?" she said softly. Daniel felt the quiet confirmation settle through him as he nodded once. Martha sighed gently and shook her head. "That dog has been out there for a long time," she continued. "Longer than most people realize. Daniel listened carefully while the low hum of conversation continued around them. Something in Martha's tone carried the weight of a story waiting to be told, and Daniel understood that the mystery of the patient shepherd beside mile marker 42 might finally be about to unfold. Martha Lawson poured more coffee into Daniel Carter's mug while the quiet murmur of the diner continued around them. For a moment she did not speak, as if weighing how much of the story she should share, and Daniel noticed the way her eyes drifted toward the front window where the morning sun lit the empty street outside. Finally, she rested her hands on the counter and let out a slow breath. "That dog did not always sit alone out there," she said gently. Daniel leaned forward slightly, listening. Martha continued in the calm tone of someone recalling a memory that had settled deeply into the town's history. "About a year ago, a Marine used to drive through town every morning around the same time you passed that road. Tall fellow, quiet but polite. His name was Michael Hayes." Daniel felt the name settle in his mind while Martha spoke. She described a man in his early 30s who had moved to Silver Creek after leaving active service. He had rented a small cabin outside town and worked occasional shifts helping a rancher repair fences and equipment. Most days he came through the diner for coffee before heading out along County Route 18. And nearly every time he arrived, the same German shepherd waited beside his truck. "That dog never left his side," Martha said softly. "People around here used to joke that the two of them looked like they had walked straight out of a training base somewhere." Daniel nodded slowly as the pieces began forming in his thoughts. A disciplined dog with a worn leather collar. A Marine who had once trusted it as a partner. Martha continued explaining that the shepherd had been trained during Hayes's service years and had followed him everywhere after he returned home. Locals often saw the two of them driving along the valley road or walking the open fields outside town while the dog stayed close beside him like a quiet shadow. Then Martha's voice softened slightly. "One evening about 11 months ago, Hayes drove out along that same highway and never made it back to town." She paused for a moment before continuing. "According to the sheriff's report, his truck had been found off the road farther down the valley after a sudden storm moved through the mountains. There had been no other vehicles involved, no sign of trouble beyond the slick roads and heavy rain that night." Daniel listened without speaking while the weight of the story slowly settled into place. "And the dog?" he asked quietly. Martha looked down at the counter for a moment before answering. "The dog was found sitting beside mile marker 42 the next morning," she said. "Right where you saw him." She explained that several people had tried to take the shepherd home during the weeks that followed. Ranchers offered food, the sheriff attempted to bring the dog into town, and even the veterinarian tried coaxing it into a truck one afternoon. But every single time the dog found its way back to that same stretch of road. After a while folks stopped trying, Martha said gently. "It never causes trouble. It just sits there and watches the highway like it is waiting for Hayes to come back around that bend." Daniel sat quietly with his coffee while the sounds of the diner carried on around him. Outside, the morning traffic of Silver Creek moved slowly along the street, unaware that miles away a patient German shepherd still kept watch beside a lonely mile marker on an empty Colorado road. Daniel Carter remained seated at the diner counter long after Martha Lawson finished speaking, his hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug while the story settled slowly in his mind. The quiet patience of the German shepherd beside mile marker 42 now carried a meaning that felt far heavier than simple curiosity. The dog had not been wandering. It had not been lost. It had returned to the last place it remembered being with the man it trusted most. Outside the window, the small town of Silver Creek moved through the gentle rhythm of morning as trucks rolled past, and the distant bell of the gas station door chimed whenever someone stepped inside. Daniel thanked Martha quietly and left a few bills on the counter before standing and pulling on his jacket. The cool mountain air greeted him again as he stepped outside, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the promise of another clear day in the valley. Daniel climbed back into his truck and started the engine, but instead of driving home, he turned the wheel toward County Route 18 once more. The road stretched out of town and climbed steadily toward the hills where the quiet mile marker waited beside the gravel shoulder. As Daniel drove, he found himself thinking about the kind of bond that forms between a soldier and a working dog. It was not the same as ordinary companionship. It was built from long hours of trust, training, and the understanding that each relied on the other in ways few people ever experienced. Daniel had seen that kind of loyalty before during his years in uniform. A good dog did not forget its partner simply because time had passed. The truck rolled around the familiar bend, and the gravel shoulder came into view again. Just as expected, the German Shepherd sat beside the mile marker, its tall silhouette unchanged against the wide Colorado sky. Daniel parked the truck and stepped out slowly. This time the dog turned its head immediately when it heard his footsteps, watching him approach with calm recognition. Daniel crouched a few feet away and placed another small piece of food on the gravel. The shepherd stepped forward and ate it before returning to its quiet watch over the road. Daniel studied the animal for a moment before speaking softly. His name was Hayes, he said. The dog's ears shifted slightly at the sound of the voice, but it remained focused on the highway stretching out before them. Daniel nodded gently, as if acknowledging the dog's silent devotion. For a few minutes they simply sat together in the calm morning light while the wind moved softly through the grass along the shoulder. Daniel knew he could not erase the memory the dog carried or replace the man it had been waiting for all this time. But as he watched the shepherd patiently guarding the empty road, he also understood something else. The dog had kept its promise to stay, and perhaps now it no longer needed to do that alone. The morning stretched quietly across the valley while Daniel Carter remained beside the German Shepherd near mile marker 42, the wide Colorado sky arching above them like an endless blue horizon. The dog continued watching the road with the same calm patience that had brought it back to this spot day after day, but now there was a subtle difference in the way it occasionally glanced toward Daniel before returning its attention to the distant bend. It was not the restless look of an animal unsure of its surroundings. It was recognition. Daniel noticed it each time the shepherd's amber eyes briefly met his before drifting back toward the empty highway. A gentle breeze moved through the tall grass beside the shoulder, carrying the quiet rustle of autumn leaves from the nearby cottonwood trees. Daniel sat with his forearms resting on his knees and studied the dog for several minutes before speaking again. "You have done your duty," he said softly, his voice calm in the open air. The shepherd's ears shifted slightly as though it heard the meaning behind the words, even if it could not understand them completely. A distant vehicle appeared along the highway again, its shape small against the pale horizon. The dog leaned forward instinctively, watching as it always did, its body alert with quiet anticipation. Daniel waited beside it while the vehicle drew closer, a dark sedan traveling steadily toward town. The shepherd's eyes followed every movement until the car passed them with a low hum and disappeared behind the rise in the road. For a moment the dog remained standing, staring after it. Then slowly it returned to its sitting position beside the mile marker. Daniel exhaled quietly. The pattern repeated again and again, each passing vehicle testing the dog's hope before returning it to silence. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the last piece of roast beef he had brought with him that morning. This time he did not toss it onto the gravel. Instead, he held it gently in his open hand and extended it toward the dog. The shepherd studied him carefully, its head tilting slightly as it considered the offering. After a few seconds, it stepped forward with slow, deliberate movements until it stood only a few feet away. The dog lowered its nose toward Daniel's hand and accepted the food quietly. The moment lingered between them for a second longer than before. When the dog stepped back again, it did not immediately return to the mile marker. Instead, it remained standing beside Daniel, watching the road from where he sat. Daniel noticed the change immediately. It was small, almost unspoken, but it mattered. The dog had shifted its position by only a few feet, yet it had chosen to stand closer to him while keeping its watch over the highway. Daniel reached out slowly and rested his hand against the dog's shoulder. The thick fur beneath his fingers felt warm despite the cool mountain air. The shepherd did not pull away. It simply stood there beside him, eyes still fixed on the empty road stretching toward the distant hills. Daniel looked down the highway once more and nodded gently to himself. The man the dog had been waiting for would never come back along that road. But the promise the dog had kept all this time did not have to end in loneliness. And perhaps for the first time since the long vigil began, the silent guardian beside mile marker 42 was beginning to understand that it no longer had to keep watch alone. The sun climbed slowly across the wide Colorado sky while Daniel Carter and the German shepherd remained beside the quiet stretch of highway near mile marker 42. The morning had grown warmer now, and the frost that once clung to the grass had long since melted into the dusty earth along the roadside. A light breeze drifted down from the hills, moving through the dog's thick coat and carrying the soft scent of pine from the distant forest. For a long time, neither Daniel nor the dog moved very much. They simply watched the road together. Every now and then another vehicle appeared far down the valley, its shape small against the distant hills. Each time the shepherd lifted its ears and studied the approaching car with the same patient attention it had shown for nearly a year. Yet now something had changed. When the vehicles passed and disappeared, the dog no longer returned all the way to the mile marker. Instead, it remained standing beside Daniel, keeping its watch from where he sat. The small shift seemed simple, but Daniel understood its meaning. The dog had begun to accept his presence as part of the quiet routine it had built around that lonely stretch of road. After a while, Daniel stood and brushed the dust from his jeans. The dog watched him carefully, its amber eyes calm and thoughtful. Daniel glanced down the empty highway one more time before resting his hand gently against the shepherd's neck, feeling the worn leather collar beneath the thick fur. "He would want you to keep moving forward," Daniel said quietly. The dog tilted its head slightly, as though considering the sound of his voice. Daniel walked slowly back toward his truck, leaving the door open for a moment as he turned to look back across the gravel shoulder. The shepherd remained still for several seconds beside the mile marker, eyes fixed once more on the distant curve where the road disappeared between the hills. The valley was quiet except for the soft whisper of wind moving through the grass. Then the dog turned. It took one step away from the mile marker, then another, its paws moving slowly across the gravel. Daniel waited beside the truck without speaking while the shepherd approached. The dog stopped a few feet away and looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. For the first time since Daniel had met it, the road behind them remained unwatched. Daniel reached down and opened the passenger door wider. The dog studied the truck for a moment before stepping forward and climbing carefully onto the seat. Daniel closed the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. When the engine started, the truck rolled slowly back onto County Route 18, the quiet highway stretching out across the valley ahead of them. In the side mirror, the mile marker grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared around the bend in the road. The shepherd sat calmly beside Daniel as they drove, its gaze no longer fixed on the empty stretch of highway behind them. Somewhere beyond the hills a new road waited. And this time the loyal dog who had once guarded the lonely mile marker would not have to travel it alone.